Greetings to everyone. We're glad you could join us today for the Ergomed webinar titled Drug Repurposing for COVID-19. My name is Philomena O'Brien and I'm the Marketing Manager at Ergomed. Before we start, I'd like to run through a couple of quick housekeeping matters. Firstly, we expect this webinar presentation to run for approximately 30 to 40 minutes, with a short amount of time at the end for questions and answers. And secondly, you're very welcome to send us your questions at any point throughout the presentation. You can do this just by typing them into the question and answer section that you'll see in your window on screen. And now I'd like to introduce you to our presenters for today. Gordana Tonkovic, who is Ergomed's Head of Clinical Development, and Sally Emanuel, our Head of Regulatory and Clinical Delivery. Both Gordana and Sally have been very involved at the front line of Ergomed's work with clients during the COVID-19 crisis. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Sally, and Sally can take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Philomena. So I'd like to start my presentation today with this quote. Potential cures and at least treatments are stuck in a chasm between scientific discovery and the doctor's office. Nowhere is this statement more true than in the case of ultra-rare and rare diseases. Due to the high unmet need that exists, they really are left at having to look at what alternative treatments are available from what is already known and available on the market in order to try and find ways of which they can manage their disease. This is known as drug repurposing. And as the name implies, it's really where you explore whether a drug that's designed for one disease can be used effectively to treat another. It's nothing new, but it's certainly had a huge boost in the era of COVID. Traditionally, it happens more by accident. And the really well-known case is that of Viagra that was originally developed or was being studied for cardiovascular disease and ended up being utilized for erectile dysfunction. But nevertheless, it really does provide a very huge opportunity to help patients, not just those that are suffering from rare and ultra-rare diseases, orphan diseases, but also those that are suffering from COVID. Now, repurposing really requires very good collaboration to connect the scientists, academia that are doing the research, publishing the papers, coming up with the theories, together with the clinicians at the front line that are treating patients. You need to connect the patient advocacy groups, and typically there's a lot of investment that comes from either government or non-governmental organizations. But supporting this collaboration is absolutely key to help further drug development from a repurposing perspective. Why is drug repurposing so important in COVID-19? The answer is obvious. There's a huge public emergency ongoing, and therefore we have to look at what drugs and treatments are available right now that might be effective, that might be utilized. And therefore there is a large amount of energy and investment being put towards finding these types of solutions. The timelines in repurposing are considerably shorter, and the success rate is considerably higher as compared to looking at novel drugs. Where previously there were barriers that are associated with intellectual property, and also looking at barriers with regards to potential return on investment, this doesn't really apply so much in COVID, as everyone is trying to coordinate their efforts, share information and data so that we can try and find a way of combating the COVID-19 and returning to normality. Of course, there's still room for further development of novel treatments. We're looking into vaccines, but nevertheless, this is a very critical part of trying to find a potential solution. So here are some examples of repurposing in coronavirus. And you can see there are some very famous drugs that are on there with regards to remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, and the list goes on. And every day there are more drugs that are being either reformulated or considered for further investigation as a potential solution. So, what are the ways in which we can learn about drugs? And what are the types of programs that exist? You have compassionate use, that is really mainly a treatment protocol that is aimed at providing immediate drug to patients that need it most. In orphan drugs, what you typically find is that at the end of a clinical trial, you need a mechanism for enabling patients to continue to have treatment via this means after the trial is completed. So, compassionate use has some limitations in terms of data collection, but nevertheless, its aim is really to treat patients and will provide some insights as to whether or not a potential drug has some clinical benefit. You then have observational trials, and these are mainly looking at the standard of care. What is the routine practice? You usually utilize them in order to draw some conclusions around the best guidance you can provide for treating a particular indication, and usually doesn't involve a lot of intervention in any way, shape, or form. You then have clinical trials, and these can either be initiated by an investigator or could be sponsored by a pharma company. And these have very strict control. They have very robust methodologies in place and are regulated under the clinical trials regulations. And the data that you gather from clinical trials can then be used to support marketing authorization applications and licensing claims. So, how can we facilitate this research, in particular looking at COVID-19? How can we assist the connections to be made between the hospitals, the patients, the government agencies, and so on? Well, there are many ways to do this. First, it's looking at how you get key opinion leaders engaged. How do you get their endorsement for your particular product? How do you raise awareness and how do you tap into the network? This can really make or break your development plan. You then need to be able to select the right sites and connect them with pharmaceutical companies that are keen to explore and conduct clinical trials in their centers. So you need a database of investigators that you can very quickly count upon, many of whom really do get in touch and tell you that they are interested and have capacity to conduct studies. But one aspect of facilitating research, and it's particularly key in orphan drugs as it is in COVID-19, and it's recognizing that not all hospitals and physicians have clinical trial experience. Not all centers are professional clinical trial centers. And therefore, they need additional support to understand the way in which the data is collected and to ensure that it's compliant and to ensure that it's robust, be it the electronic platforms utilized, whether it's managing the central laboratories and shipment of samples, liaising with vendors, etc. It's ensuring that you can really help those sites, particularly those that don't have a lot of experience, to have the time to be able to do it correctly. So having this sort of platform and system in place really means that you can hold their hand every step of the way and minimize the burden. And this is why it's so relevant in the case of COVID-19, when they are already inundated with the volume of patients coming in every day and they have limited resources available. Of course, you look at lessons learned from ongoing clinical studies so that you can use that to inform your clinical development plan. So this is in relation to looking at non-COVID studies. What is happening right now? What are the changes that are being implemented? How are we ensuring that those trials can still continue to be conducted? And that might be looking at how you're now shipping drug to patients. What modifications did you make? How are you looking at the data? How is the data being cleaned? All of those strategies that are being deployed as we speak on ongoing studies, all of that learning can be utilized to inform your COVID-19 clinical study, because it's still happening and has to happen during the course of this pandemic. Finally, it's important to really highlight the importance of managing all the stakeholders involved: the sites, the patients, the investigators, the key opinion leaders, the industry, just to ensure that you have good governance and oversight, ensure everyone is aligned. And by doing so, you really do increase the chances of success. So, going into a little bit more detail about the potential pathways for COVID-19 repurposing, I mentioned earlier the different types of research, and I want to touch upon a couple of points. When we look at compassionate use or off-label usage, you have a limited number of patients. Sometimes it would be on a named patient basis, or it could be on a cohort of patients, but certainly it isn't open for every single patient to be treated. And you need pretty good justification and guidance on your dosing and treatment schedule, why you've determined that the dose and the safety information you've seen perhaps in one indication is appropriate for another. And as I mentioned, limited data can be collected. It's mainly down to safety reporting at this point. And whilst you do see a large treatment effect, it's really because you're having very small patient populations. And it can be a really valuable way of getting some idea whether the potential candidate drug really has clinical benefit. The next thing you do is really move into an observational clinical trial so that you can enroll more patients. You could have control groups. You can look at standard of care. How did those patients that were treated under the compassionate use compare to those that were treated against all other treatment options that were available at the site? And with these types of observational studies, you really are recommended to focus on the sort of significant outcomes like death or intubation or length of ICU stay, for example. Once you have that data, you're able to very quickly make some decisions as to whether it's worth investing in full clinical development, looking at phase 2 and phase 3. And in that context, you can control your patient population, you can determine the inclusion-exclusion criteria. You still have to obviously be able to justify the dose and treatment schedules as before, but this time you are really allowed to collect very detailed data that you can be very specific about. And with a very homogeneous group of patients, you're able to show statistically that there's a clear benefit as a result of your drug. So a question that often comes up is really, what are the non-clinical data requirements? And of course, these are not changed just because we are looking at COVID. You still need to have the same level of rigor with regards to safety, tolerability, and efficacy. But there are slight variances when it comes to off-label or compassionate use scenarios. So for example, in places like Italy or Finland, you are able to start compassionate use even with as little as phase 1 data. In most countries, you're expected to show at least phase 2 safety and tolerability. But nevertheless, as you progress through the clinical development, you will be expected to have the full battery of tests available to prove that the drug in question is safe and is effective prior to gaining marketing authorization. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Gordana, who will talk a little bit about the medical and operational considerations.
Thank you very much, Sally. So what I'd like to share with you here is really some of the key elements of clinical development when repurposing for COVID-19. So what is the first question actually is really to ask when considering a product to be used for COVID-19. Where and what is the best position for this product? So if the product has potential to be used for a causal treatment, like example is antivirals, this means that usually we are going early in a treatment. We are usually treating patients with mild, moderate disease. Bigger sample size is needed because this is a self-limiting disease. It's in many patients, especially younger one or healthy. Key challenges with causal treatment is actually lack of medical records for mild disease patients, because many of these patients are staying at home, and even if they are admitted to the hospital, they do not stay in a hospital long enough, and afterwards they don't have regular follow-ups. So this might be a challenge which has to be overcome. And of course, due to a really severe complication of disease, many investigators are very much focused on more severe patients. So really the motivation of investigators and availability also has to be taken into consideration. In case the product has a potential to be positioned as a symptomatic treatment, mainly in this COVID-19 means really to treat excessive immune reaction. We speak about usually patients who have advanced disease, severe disease, mainly patients in the ICU. So we have here usually very clear primary objective, which is mortality. There are plenty of medical records because they are part of the routine practice. Highly motivated investigators because of a huge unmet need. The main challenges are standard of care is highly variable. This is what we are seeing. The treatments are changing. It's very different in every hospital, every country. It's changing based on the available new research data. And of course, the population is, we know that this is mainly elderly people with many comorbidities. So to get really homogeneous data and population, it's not really easy. So it has to be taken into consideration. So how the treatment, what is really required to start really treating patients with COVID-19? There are, I would say, two questions to be answered. So first, there must be a justification. There might be a benefit, potential benefit for the patients with COVID-19. This can be based on mechanism action, which means actually that provided data in preclinical, mainly preclinical setting, in vitro, in vivo data, or the products which are already approved for some indication or are in development, so they're already human data in humans, there might be really similar clinical presentation and they already have some proven efficacy. Another question really important to start when starting completely new population, when the product is developing for completely different indication, is actually to justify the dose. One thing with regards to the dose is to prove that in this patient population, the safety profile is acceptable. And on the other hand, the dose has to be enough that to give a chance to this drug to work and to be efficient. So this is why the dose and the treatment schedule has to be adapted to this specific patient population. Some of the challenges, operational challenges and designing studies are like that. As I already mentioned, this is really the evolving knowledge. This is the new disease. Of course, we already know about coronavirus, but this is a new disease, and we are actually daily knowing more and more and learning about the additional complication or prognostic factors. So this is something that we have to be continuously in this research to be able to make proper research in this environment. As previously mentioned, motivation of investigators and burden of staff is key, because this is also changing, and we really have to be very careful with the site selection. Some of the things we have also faced, that we realize drug availability might be also an issue, because some of these products might be for rare disease or in early development, so there are not enough available drug. So from operational point of view, expedite site selection, this means continuous relationship, and what we have through our site management model, what we have realized that this is really key, to have a relationship with investigators and really to understand what's happening and how the situation is evolving, with regards to the patients and with regards to the resources and actually availability to do the clinical trial. Similarly to this is actually competition. Of course, many trials starting in COVID-19. Regulatory landscape is changing, adapting to the situation really rapidly. Then, of course, because it's an infectious disease, collection, verification of study data, whether it's possible to visit the sites or not, to do remotely appropriate approach, and not to burden the site staff. All these things have to be taken into consideration in order to really be successful and conduct successfully the trial. Of course, GDPR also has to be covered. So what I would like to share really in just a couple of slides with you, really one of the approaches which can take place for when considering a drug to be repurposed for COVID-19. This is something that we found a way to be fast, really to start gaining knowledge about the potential safety and about the safety and potential efficacy of the product in this very specific patient population, and it's a cost-efficient approach. So how we entered into this, that we have been approached by our long-standing partner, and even though we are mainly focused on rare diseases, but actually we have realized that this request from our long-standing partner makes sense, because actually this even pandemic, it has many similarities, or really requires a similar approach what we actually apply in rare diseases, because we work oftenly with compassionate use program. We work oftenly that we need urgently to give treatment to the patient, huge unmet need, and very often with the disease that are not very well known. So what has happened here, how we started this one of the approaches possible, is actually we had a request on the 9th of March that we have to enable somehow that the already marketed product has to be approved through compassionate use program, and the patients to be treated, because there was really a huge unmet need at that time in Italy. So what we have set together, and actually the experts from a regulatory, medical, from operations, we set together working 24 hours, and we designed a compassionate use program, informed consent, really difficult in this situation. And in actually 2 days, we had everything submitted, approved, and the first patients received the treatment actually 2 days, a little bit more than 2 days after the initial request. But this was just the first step of this approach to repurposing, because this allows really to collect safety data, to gain some knowledge about the product, but mainly based on safety. We knew that if we want to collect really and to learn about whether this product is safe and is efficient compared to the other available treatments, we have to do actually the observational trial. And therefore, we continued with the work for the next 7 days, and we designed the observational program study, which will compare actually standard of treatment to the patients treated with this product. And again, it was a lot of work of different experts, And we have managed to obtain this approval again immediately after submission. Verbally, there were no requests, and we have got the approval and the program starts. So this is really the way how we can really early start gaining knowledge about potential of this product in this indication. And this sets the scene actually to start to have enough knowledge to design a proper industry-sponsored clinical trial, which can be the last step before market authorization. So this is what Sally will now explain further, how this can go and how to address this further.
Thank you, Gordana. So looking at the clinical trial submission process, there's a lot of legislation and guidelines that are coming out now with regards to how we should be conducting COVID-19 studies and the fact that they will receive priority review. They have instructions in the way in which you should communicate, how you should address the subject of the email, and what phone numbers to call to ensure that they have received your application. And many of the authorities are actually offering free scientific advice. According to EMEA, they actually are providing and encouraging sponsors to get in touch so that you can have early discussions. And at a national level, there are also additional pathways that I'll discuss a little bit more. You have in the EU the VHP, which is a centralized process of submitting your clinical trial application for authorization, and it allows all member states to review, and they've created the Priority Plus system for VHP that will help for COVID-19 specifically. Now, the timelines for review are varied, and I'll mention them later in the presentation, but they still are getting a large volume of applications coming through, and it's encouraged to ensure that your application is of very high quality to minimize questions that are being raised. They also have, in certain countries, designated centers of excellence that are responsible for reviewing from an ethics committee perspective. And information is being made available to the public so that you have some ideas of how long it takes, what's been approved, what is the competition that's ongoing. And this is all very valuable when preparing a clinical trial application. So here are some examples of national procedures, and they do vary somewhat, and I wanted to give you a variety to look at. So in Belgium, for instance, if you're doing your study only in Belgium and are not intending to include patients in other countries, then they recommend you go through what they have at the moment is the clinical trial pilot system. It's a pilot scheme that they have ongoing, and it allows you to have just a single regulatory or ethics review process that takes place, and you also receive free scientific and technical advice. They acknowledge your application within 4 working days, and whilst the typical clinical trial review timelines still apply, the experience thus far has been that they're quite swift in performing their reviews. In Italy, we've seen a large number of clinical trials. They're all actually published on the AIFA, the Ministry of Health webpage. They're a great source to see not only the level of competition, how many studies are being done, but you can also have access to the protocols and study documents as well. And this is available, as I mentioned, on the regulatory agency website. They've also designated the Spallanzani in Rome as the Infectious Disease Institute responsible for reviewing all COVID-19 studies. There are more instructions around how to notify, even for compassionate use, and how to go about getting approval in an expedited manner. In the Netherlands, we have, again, a fast track system that's been established. The same instructions with regards to how to communicate with the authorities apply. Each one has their own specific guidance. But it's really important here to make sure that you've selected the right site, because the national coordinator in the Netherlands will be responsible for your choice of ethics committee that you will submit to. And there are a number of accredited ethics committees, And it's worth highlighting something I will discuss later on, the principle of deferred consent. Consenting process in the Netherlands is very specific. They have their own formats, and it's important to know up front how you must design the documentation in order to get approval. In the UK, they have introduced a review panel that is responsible for assessing whether or not a proposed clinical trial in COVID is duplicating efforts that may otherwise be underway. They review the scientific rationale and provide feedback on the proposed clinical trial design. So the first step is that you must submit to the CRN, the Clinical Research Network. They meet every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and will provide feedback within 2 working days. And once they endorse your study, it goes to a second review panel. And after approximately 5 days to a week, they're able to determine whether or not they approve the study to be conducted in the whole of the UK, or if they feel that adjustments need to be made, they will make recommendations for changes that should be introduced. But once it's placed on a national register on the priority list of COVID-19 studies, then you can go ahead with submitting via the central portfolio management system to both the ethics committees, the R&D committees, as well as to the Ministry of Health, the MHRA. So just to touch upon the subject of informed consent. As I mentioned, it's important to take the lessons learned from ongoing studies. And due to this pandemic and the infectious disease, sometimes we're looking at whether we can implement e-consent or verbal consent, provided it's documented in the source notes. We've been working with a number of different centres that have different policies in place. Very early on in this pandemic, certain sites and hospitals were letting us know that they had already been earmarked and nominated as the centre for COVID-19 treatment. And with that, they advised us that it would be best to take the documents that we had stored at the site level for clinical trials that were ongoing and move them to archive or other locations, because they had been advised that all documents were going to be burnt after the COVID pandemic treatment had been completed. So there are specifics around whether they will allow you to actually have written consents or whether they feel that it's too much of an infection risk. And therefore, you need to think up front whether you will implement e-consent and whether or not it's actually permitted at a national level. It's important to include data protection declaration and information, and even more so right now in this environment where we are sometimes looking at studies that will have patient information being shared with third parties, where you're shipping study materials, kits to patients' home, and therefore you need their explicit permission before you release their home address and other personal details. So it's very, very important to ensure that you have consulted with your data protection officer, and also that at the site, to ensure that whatever is planned for executing the study is also going to be permissible from a regulatory standpoint. In the example that you saw with the case study with the submissions in Italy, one of the things that we did was really to start working on arranging translations of documents whilst they were still in draft form, ensuring that we were highlighting at every step changes that were introduced so that we ended up with a document that was accurate as intended. But working with a very good translation agency, and in particular, in our case, we decided to leverage the services of a company that was several time zones away, meant that we could work around the clock. So as documents were being prepared in the day, they were translated overnight and available for review the next day. And this is a strategy that I think is very useful, ensuring that you have very good quality translation vendors available to support this activity. And as with any clinical study, our recommendation is to ensure that you build the country-specific requirements into your informed consent upfront, rather than wait for questions and comments to come back asking for modifications. It's far better to do this in a proactive way so you can minimize the number of questions and thereby speed the time for getting approval. Now, informed consent in emergency setting and in ICU deserves further consideration. It's a lot more technical, and what is permitted in one country might not be permitted in another. One of the things that we did that I'd like to share is really to look at how you can utilize a doctor's declaration to treat patients in emergency, draft that documentation to satisfy the ethics committees, and have it available up front so that the PI, the investigator, can be in a position to really consent for those that are unable to consent for themselves. At the same time, you need to also prepare a consent form for when the patient is able to regain the ability to consent. And knowing that you need this up front means then you can discuss with the authorities more specifically. So in the Netherlands, they have a very clear pathway and requirements for what they call deferred consent. Equally, there is also the option of looking at getting consent from a legally authorized representative, or sometimes known as a legally appointed representative. The addition of such lines needs to be linked with the disease in question or the indication in question, and whether we have, quarantine processes that are in place that don't allow for a legally authorized representative to consent on behalf of a family member or not. And again, in certain countries, as example here is Belgium, they have no such concept within the regulations. Simply you require a legal adult to consent, but not one that has been appointed by the courts or authorized legally to be able to perform this activity. Of course, wherever possible, it makes sense to try and obtain verbal consent, but ensure that it's recorded in the source notes. And if possible, avoid including additional lines for a witness to see the consent or to hear the consent being provided. Or sometimes in other cases, I've seen examples where there's been an introduction of an independent physician and a requirement for their signature prior to being able to enroll a patient. And if you can avoid these, provided they are permitted in the country in question, then it goes a long way to minimize the burden that you will have on-site staff that are already very busy with limited resources. So I've come to the end of the presentation, and hopefully we've given you some ideas on the approach to repurposing, particularly those that we've leveraged from orphan drug studies. The network and platform to connect patients, doctors, academia, and facilitate the research is absolutely key for successful repurposing, as is the technical expertise to be able to design scientifically sound and clinically operable protocols. We work very closely with the investigators in question, with the pharma companies, our medical writing, medical affairs, regulatory, round-the-clock meetings to ensure that we're able to develop a document that's robust, can be defended, and is likely to be approved. Understanding the regulatory pathways that are available are absolutely key. I should really highlight that in the case study we had with the compassionate use for a drug that was already marketed in an orphan disease is somewhat of an exception that exists for Italy specifically, where the same regulations that cover off-label usage are also applied in the compassionate use context. And knowing how to circumvent and navigate the regulations in the most expeditious way makes the difference in terms of getting drugs and treatment available to patients who need it most. Understanding the local culture, know-how, all plays into how quickly you're able to activate your clinical trial. And having this geographical footprint that allows you to track the progress of COVID, search the infection rates in the different countries, and make recommendations on which are the best sites, what is the best time, how to leverage the data, how to assist with data capture and cleaning and analysis, all comes into play with regard to bridging some of the gaps that exist with the key stakeholders that are on the front line trying to find solutions for COVID-19. And of course, a solution and partnership is key as we utilize the expertise of everyone we have in-house, everyone at the site, everyone at the pharma company, to all come together to find solutions for the greater good. So this picture at the end that you see of the Volvo Ocean Race, we felt really demonstrated the spirit of how repurposing in times of COVID works. It's really a team effort with a multidisciplinary team of experts, each one knowing exactly what role they have to play, working in an environment where you're navigating almost uncharted waters. We're working around the clock, and it's a time where speed is also of the essence. And coming together in this way is certainly very fulfilling for us, and hopefully yields successful collaborations that deliver solutions for COVID-19. So with that, I'll pass you on to Filomena, who will manage the question and answers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sally and Gordana, for your really informative presentation. It was great. So looking on screen now, I can see that we've had quite a lot of questions coming through while you've both been talking. So let's see if we can answer a couple of these now while we still have a little bit of time left. Okay, first I'll read out a question that we've received from a biotech company. The question is, does a drug need to be relabeled for compassionate use? Sally, I think you're probably the best person to answer this one.
Yes. Typically, as I mentioned, in compassionate use, you're working with drugs that haven't yet been marketed. So the assumption is that you already have your clinical trial drug label, and you're now going to utilize it in a compassionate use setting. The requirements for compassionate use labeling are almost the same as those for GMP Annex 13. The only difference being that you are typically required to remove the statement that reads for clinical trial use only and replace it with for compassionate use only, not for resale. In certain countries, they might have additional requirements. So for example, in the Czech Republic, you have to put a label to say special therapeutic use. But for the most part, those are the only changes that you would be required, and everything else on Annex 13 per your clinical trial label would be acceptable.
Great, thank you, Sally. Okay, next we have a question from a specialty pharma company. The question is, how do you find the appropriate sites to conduct studies for COVID-19? Gordana, I think this is an appropriate question for you. If I could pass this to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Filomena. So, yes, I think in this COVID-19 specific situation, I can say that more than ever, it's about continuity and the relationship with the sites. So just to describe this, maybe that from one example, so discussing a clinical study with an investigator in beginning of February is and then applying it without knowing new information 2-3 weeks later, not to say now, is completely not adequate. So this means really in this situation, doing really being very active, continually in this research is the only way the sites can be really properly assessed and selected for the research. So the long-term relationship with many sites is also really important to parameter and which will ensure that really the sites are selected that have enough patients and that have enough resource and availability. Thank you very much.
And just to add to that last question, I think, looking at sites is always done from many different prisms. And from a regulatory standpoint, what we do is look at the location of the site, the ethics committee that they're associated with, and the timelines it will take to get them up and running. So you select those sites that are optimal, that have quick timelines and less hurdles in terms of official documentation that they expect to review before they're able to issue their approvals. Thanks.
Thank you both. So apologies, everyone. This is all that we have time for today. It's wonderful that this webinar has generated so many good questions, and we'd really like to answer everyone who has taken the time to ask. So we'll endeavour to reply personally via email to all outstanding questions by the end of this week. To conclude our webinar session for today, we'd like to thank everyone once again for joining us. We really hope you found our presentation both interesting and informative. And to remind you that this webinar will be available for download from the Ergomed website from tomorrow. Plus, we'll also include a link in our next newsletter. This ends our webinar session. Thank you very much again.